Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. When Christians of any age or denomination debate the nature of the good life, the soul, free will, truth in fact, their thought process tends to fall back to Aristotelian principles. Not a Christian himself, but Aristotle made full use of general revelation, natural light, to arrive at deep truths about the nature of God, human identity, and the universe. Dr. Louis Markos joins us to talk about this. Louis is most recently the author of From Aristotle to Christ, How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith. He's also professor of English at Houston Christian University. Louis, it's so great to speak with you again. How are you?
Thanks. It's great to be back with Ave Maria Radio.
So, From Aristotle to Christ, the presupposition here is that the average Christian ought to have some capacity of navigating the thought of Aristotle for illumination of the Christian faith. I'd like to begin there.
Yes, and I do believe that's important, and you kind of gave us the key word a moment ago, general revelation. Mm-hmm. Special revelation is the way God speaks directly to us through the Old and New Testament, the prophets, supremely Christ himself. But that is not the only way God speaks. God also speaks through what is called general revelation. And by the way, this concept is accepted by Aquinas and Calvin alike, so it is not unique to one Christian denomination. We all believe that God speaks through creation, he speaks through conscience, he speaks through reason, he speaks through imagination. And in a person like Aristotle or Plato, but Aristotle today, I think we find general revelation at its height. And I, in fact, believe sincerely that God used thinkers like Plato and Aristotle and Cicero to prepare the pagan Greco world for the coming of Christ. As Christians, we believe that Jesus was born in the fullness of time. Certainly that fullness included the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, the Roman roads that were safe to travel on. But I believe it also includes the Greek philosophy that was so important to the apostles and early church fathers, giving them a language in which to express the truths that were revealed in Christ in the Bible. So I think it's important, and I think that language is helpful to make sense of Christian theology.
Now, because of the necessity of that, or at least the centrality of that language, it is extremely crucial that we understand that, for example, the authors of the New Testament, they themselves weren't swimming in a vacuum. There was Hellenistic influence that shaped the language of the Scriptures.
Yes, it is important to understand that. See, God chose well. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew, which is a more poetic language, rather like Old English, and it's very good for expressing prophecy and wisdom literature and whatnot. But for the New Testament, God chose Greek, which, like Latin after it, is a much more precise language with a precise grammar that allows for a certain expression. People often forget as well that at the time of Jesus, many of the Jews were actually using the Septuagint. That is the translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Koine Greek, the common Greek that was spread throughout the Mediterranean world by Alexander the Great and his heirs. And so we don't think that, I'm just making this up as an academic. In the book of Daniel, God sends Nebuchadnezzar the dream of the giant with the four metals. And those four metals represent Babylon, that's the head, then Persia, then Greece, as in Alexander the Great, and then Rome. And it's during the Fourth Kingdom, the Roman kingdom, that this stone, uncut by human hands, falls, hits the feet of the statue, and crushes it, but that stone turns into a mountain. So what I'm saying is, all the way back to the time of Daniel, God is preparing that world so that Babylon gives way to Persia, gives way to the Hellenistic Greek empires, which gives way to Rome, and there at the height, at the beginning of the Roman Empire, Christ is born, and the New Testament is revealed, and we get the early church fathers. So again, I do believe it is consistent with Christianity to say that people like Aristotle were used by the God he did not know to prepare the world for that coming and to give a language in which Christian doctrine could be expressed and understood.
One of the things that this highlights, therefore, is, like you rightly mentioned, this was the God he did not know. He didn't have divine revelation, which means natural reason has a tremendously high capacity of coming to pierce the realities of truth and transcendental truth.
Yes, this is very important. See, there's such a misunderstanding, this phrase total depravity, which is used more by Calvinists.
Yeah.
That means that all parts of our person was subjected to the fall. That's okay. A Catholic would agree with that. But that is not the same thing as what some people call utter depravity, where we are so fallen that our black is God's white and our white is God's black. And I just don't think that's true. When we fell into sin and depravity, but we did not lose the imago Dei, the image of God. We are still creatures made in God's image who have rationality, the ability to reason, who have conscience, who have the ability to seek after virtue. We can't save ourselves, but we can seek after reason and virtue. A good example of the way many of the medievals thought about Aristotle is it's similar to the way Dante thought about Virgil. Dante has Virgil be his guide through the Inferno and through most of Purgatory because he felt that in Virgil we get reason as far as it can go, sort of on its own steam. He can't get to heaven without Beatrice, who represents divine grace. But Virgil, who is like the poetic version, if you will, of Aristotle, both of them, influencing Aquinas, that again, Aristotle went as far as he could. And because he did that, he was able to lay a foundation that was helpful back then, but it's still helpful now, especially in areas like virtue. We can learn a great deal from Aristotle. Aquinas is always quoting Aristotle. In fact, for Aquinas, Aristotle is simply the philosopher, the way Virgil is simply the poet to Dante.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. And if I may invite you to just shed some light on this, because I don't know if all of our listeners are aware that Virgil was to Aristotle what Dante was to Aquinas.
Yeah, wait a minute. I think the other way. Yeah, that Virgil is to Dante, right? What Aristotle was to. Yes, very much so. It's what Dante sees is Virgil is laying a groundwork for epic poetry, for poetry that is seriously dealing with issues of humanity, including even things like heaven and hell. Mm-hmm. And Dante saw in Virgil, again, it's often expressed this way, the farthest human reason can go apart from that direct special revelation. Also, though, it was considered that Plato and Aristotle and Virgil, that they were as far as you could get with what they called the four classical virtues. That would be courage, temperance, prudence, and justice. And it was felt that these virtuous pagans, like an Aristotle or a Plato or a Virgil or Cicero, even a Seneca, that they were able to embody those virtues as fully as possible. They did not save them, as we would say, but it allowed them to reach a level of virtue and understanding that we as believers can learn from, very much so. And so they both, and the funny thing is, Dante, if he wanted to, could have actually had Aquinas as his guide, but then he would have lost the poetic or aesthetic precedent that is coming from Virgil. But I mean, you can draw a straight line from Aristotle to Aquinas to Dante in terms of the way Dante sort of orders the sins and orders the virtues, and the whole ordering, not only ethically, but the ordering cosmologically of Dante's universe is going back to Aristotle by way of Aquinas.
My guest is Dr. Louis Markos, and he is the author most recently From Aristotle to Christ, How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith. Continuing on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Dr. Louis Markos, who is the author of From Aristotle to Christ, How Aristotelian Thought Clarified the Christian Faith. Louis, I want to pick up by talking about some of the core transcendental truths, these first principle realities of logic that every individual ought to have before we even start considering the inquiry into greater mysteries. And you present 6 of them that you call why it's impossible to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast.
Right. It's Aristotle. Let's not say he invented it. Let's say he discovered it because it's a truth there, right? Just like Newton didn't discover the laws of gravitation. He figured out what they were and put them in numerical ratios and whatnot. So the law of non-contradiction, that A cannot also be B at the same time and in the same way. These are foundational rules of logic. And, I never thought we'd get this far in our country. Now, things have gotten more sane in the last year, but we were getting to a point where you were hearing actual academics say something like logic and reason are somehow white things. First of all, that's an incredibly racist statement, but it's also a nonsensical statement. And if we no longer can use the system of logic and reason laid down by people like Aristotle, we're not going to be able to talk to each other, Marcus. We're not going to be able to have the deliberative representational democracy that we have in this country if we can't speak. So we need ground rules. In fact, Aristotle often said that logic was not a separate category for him. It wasn't like biology or ethics or something. It was the foundation of all the disciplines. Because if you don't have logical thought, if you can't understand what we call deductive or inductive reasoning, if we can't make a step-by-step process in understanding the nature of reality, then we can't really practice any discipline. So we need that as a foundation.
In a lot of ways, what we're looking at right now is the result of either an obtuseness or just unwillingness to practice non-contradiction. Because like you said, this isn't something that needs to be taught, trained, or learned. This is implicitly known by the intellectual nature.
Yeah, this is just, we just have to get away from this. Like, there was even this talk in America of, well, it is in this people's culture to be late, so you can't, fire them if they come late to work, which is nonsense. I live in a city with lots of people from India, and whenever I have a party, Indian Standard Time is like 30 minutes late. But Indians are always on time for work, okay? There's a totally difference between a cultural let's arrive late and the ability to live by discipline and by the rules, and in this case, living by logic, that two things can't be the same thing at the same time and in the same way. We need that as a foundation, or we can't argue at all.
And therefore, as we're looking at, for example, the principle of non-contradiction, that paves the way into questions of, say, the correspondence theory of truth.
Right. And this is so important for when we study the scriptures, right? Yeah. If we cannot argue that there is a relationship between words and the meanings of those words, we're in big trouble. Now, let me give you some terminology that sounds strange today. What does realism mean? Well, for many people, realism means, watching gangster movies or some nonsense like that, or people cursing. That's real. No. Realism, understood philosophically by a Plato or an Aristotle, is the belief that behind our words and ideas are real things. Plato called them the forms. Aristotle had different ways of talking about them, but he still believed that behind our words was real meaning. But the other side is called nominalism. Think of the word anonymous. That means without a name. Nominalism means in name only. And this is the idea that there is no one-to-one correspondence between our words, the signifier, and what they mean, the signified. And this is a very dangerous idea that has popularized through what's called deconstruction and postmodernism. And to me, it's very much not a biblical understanding. And it allows you to start messing with the Word of God and making it mean whatever you want it to mean. In fact, one of the characters in Alice in Wonderland, it's actually Humpty Dumpty, says, words mean whatever I want them to mean. Well, that's not true.
Well, and that's so the whole thing of Humpty Dumpty having a great fall is a good.
Right.
It really is a good corollary to that principle. If words mean whatever you want it to mean, reality means whatever you want it to mean until you fall and you can't be put together. So tell us about the nature of reality.
Yeah, and again, the nature of reality is that it is ordered and balanced and harmonious. There's design. You know, one of the best apologetics continues to be the argument by design. The universe is designed. It must have a designer. By the way, some of the people that still want to be atheists say, well, it only looks designed because we're living in a simulation. They actually say that, which is kind of funny. I mean, it's just grasping at straws, as they would say.
Yeah, the Matrix theory.
Yeah, that kind of idea that we're actually in a, but again, these things are important. And what's funny is, I've studied that children all around the world are all naturally intelligent design theorists because they recognize design, and that's why they're always asking the why question. And their why question usually covers a who question. Who designed this? Why is it designed the way it is? And one of the most important things that Aristotle gave us, along with his logic, is what he calls the four causes. And whenever you speak of something, it could have a number of different causes. And today, we only want to focus on the material, the sort of efficient cause and effect, and we don't want to worry about what Aristotle called the formal cause. What is the form or essence of the thing? And we also ignore the final cause. What is the ultimate purpose, the telos or purposeful end of this thing? We just feel like when we're doing, quote, science, we have to limit ourselves to simple cause and effect and material cause and effect and just cut off the formal and final. And that has caused a great deal of problems and continues to cause a lot of problems.
And so what you're presenting to us, even those things that you just so brilliantly walked us through, is a grammar of thinking rightly, which, frankly, everyone ought to have before we start thinking, engaging in the work of what is true. How can I know what is true? How to assess if a claim is objectively true or not?
That's well put, and it is a grammar. Look, so many American teachers think that their job is to teach kids to think for themselves. That's not their job. Their job is to teach kids to think rightly.
Yes.
Now, when I say that, I don't mean brainwashing the kids to believe what you believe. That's not thinking. Thinking rightly is in terms of what you just said, the grammar of logical and rational thought and how things have to be developed. And we have to understand what our presuppositions are and how we build on that. That's what allows for real dialogue and discourse. And if everybody in the dialogue doesn't know, if they think, again, words mean whatever I want them to mean, then there is no dialogue. And the best example of deconstruction is if you said to somebody something like homosexuality is a sin, all they want to talk about is, well, what do you mean by homosexuality? What do you mean by a sin? And does that word have any meaning? And you see how we do an edge around so we don't have to deal with, not only do we not want to be accountable to God, we don't want to be accountable to reality, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so we need that framework. And again, this pagan writer, Aristotle, who died about 350 years before Christ was born, offers us that framework that we can build on.
Louis, the other issue, when we consider building upon this framework, is the question of this, what the thing is, or when I used to teach philosophy, I'd say the isness of the thing, or the substance, and the language of substance and accidents. Because learning that concept helps you understand how ideas can change and yet remain the same, but that's also true for things in reality.
Well, this is interesting because, of course, this is a Catholic radio station, and Aristotle gave language to help Catholic theologians explain what's called transubstantiation, that the actual the substance of the bread and wine changes so that it is the body and blood of Christ, but its accidents, the things we associate with it, continue to be bread and wine. It's interesting that Aristotle can offer a language that can be used to explain a Christian mystery. But he has been very helpful, Aristotle, and again, often filtered through Aquinas, but Aquinas is very upfront about how much of a help Aristotle is.
Because of this, as we are rounding out this segment, Louis, a very quick exhortation. How can our listeners begin thinking about Aristotle's teachings, terms, and applying it to their faith?
I think that the best place to start would be Aristotle's book, Nicomachean Ethics. And in fact, if your readers like to read C.S. Lewis, take Mere Christianity and look at Book 3. Book 3 is Lewis arguing for what it means to live the Christian life, a virtuous life. It is completely undergirded by an Aristotelian idea that virtue is not a feeling, it is an action that if we perform it again and again, it will become a habit. So I would encourage you to read Book 3 of Mere Christianity, and then, at least the first few chapters of it, and then you can pick up the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle and explore what virtue means. And, he's got that famous virtue is the mean between the extremes, what we call the golden mean. Mm-hmm. Courage is to be distinguished from its lack, which is cowardice, but it's also to be distinguished from its excess, which is sort of being cocky and impulsive and rushing in without thought. Neither one of those things is courage. Courage is the mean between the extremes. So I think that's a good place to start.
I think that's brilliant. Thank you very much for making the time, Louis. Always a blessing to reconnect with you.
Hey, good talking to you. Blessings for Advent and Merry Christmas.
Likewise, blessings for Advent and Merry Christmas. I've been talking with Dr. Louis Markos. He's the author, most recently, of From Aristotle to Christ. I cannot begin to urge all of you to get a copy of this from InterVarsity Press. It's a very easy read that inducts Christians into assessing reality rightly in the language that the Church has baptized. Continuing on the other side of the hour, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.